So when planning with the native Unity planting tools, we have to understand what's going on with terrains because there's some limitations with how Unity plants and how the details of that you need to understand, or else we can get ourselves in a little bit of trouble. So let's talk about the theory, and then I'm going to show you in Unity what this all looks like. So Unity has to plant on a terrain, not a mesh. We brought our meshes in, and Unity wants to plant on a terrain. Okay, so remember our terrain that we brought in with our LiDAR, it needs to plant on that. Now, VS Pro has some flexibility there, but we're not talking about VS Pro, we're talking about Unity. So we have to plant on a terrain. The terrain, so that leaves us with the problem. We got to make sure that that terrain is exactly the same height as our meshes, or else things are going to look funny because meshes are what we're going to see in game. So we want to make sure that whatever we're planting is at the same height of our meshes. We don't want our grasses sunk under the ground or our trees way up in the air and something goofy like that, right? So when we plant with Unity tools, they're called Unity terrain planted trees, but they can't be used by GS Pro. GS Pro actually needs game object trees. I know you're kind of like, well, what's the difference there? Well, I'm going to show you here in a minute. But the bottom line is we're going to have to do some conversion to make that happen so that our trees can be used by GS Pro. If your terrain is turned on, so here's another problem. If your terrain is turned on, in other words, when I say turned on and it's made visible, it's going to be at the same height as our meshes and they're going to clash. Okay, it's going to look horrible. So we have to work a way around that as well. So we'll talk about that. Converting trees to game objects will cause them to be rendered twice because we drew them on our Unity terrain and then we convert them to game objects. So now the trees are actually being drawn twice. So we need a way to disable half those trees, the ones that are duplicates, and we'll talk about doing that too. You can disable the terrain trees by turning off the terrain draw, but your grasses will disappear. What does that mean? Um, in other words, when we have this double rendered issue that we're talking about here, we need to disable some of our trees, but when we do that, the catch-22 as well, when we turn off our grasses when you do that. So that's a problem. How are we going to fix that? Well, the solution here is we're going to create another terrain that we're going to call grasses. And so what's that mean? Well, we're going to plant our trees on the main terrain, okay, that we already created, and we'll plant our grasses on the grass terrain. Simple, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to disable draw on both terrains. So what does that mean? Well, it means we won't be able to see the terrains, but we'll be able to see the grasses and trees that are planted on them. And then we're also going to disable foliage draw on the main terrain so that our trees that we draw on our main terrain are hidden, but the converted trees will not be hidden. Now, I know I just gave you guys a lot of information, so let me show you this in Unity, and then maybe it'll make sense. In Unity. And you can see that I have a grasses terrain that I created, and I'm going to show you guys how to do this in another video. So don't worry, just pay attention to what's going on here. And if I turn off the grasses terrain, well, my grasses disappear because they are planted on that terrain. So if I disable it in my inspector here, I disable my grasses. So another thing is if I go into my settings on my grasses, I could turn on the draw for my grass terrain. If I do that, things get really ugly because now we are seeing that terrain and it's clashing. It's the same height as my meshes. So we want to leave that off. Otherwise, it's just going to look horrible, right? And we don't want to lower it because if we lower, our grasses are going to go down with it and disappear under our meshes. So we're going to leave the draw on our grasses terrain off. Now, another thing I can do here is I can do tree and detail objects, and I can turn those. If I disable these off, my grasses disappear because they are what we call a detail object. So on my grasses terrain, I'm drawing my detail objects, which are my grasses, but I'm not drawing the terrain itself, so that is hidden. And now you can see I have my grasses here. Now, on the other hand, I have my trees. And my trees are planted on my inner terrain. So if I turn off my inner terrain, my trees disappear. And what also happens? Well, if I go in the settings here, if I turn on, this is my main terrain, turn that draw on. And of course, I'm going to leave that off because this looks horrible if I leave it on. but I can't lower it underneath my meshes, because if I lower this, let me just show you guys. If I lower this, look what happens to my trees. My trees start to disappear, right? So I don't want to lower that in order to turn off, say I turn on draw here, and I raise this up. You can see there's my terrain, and now I'm going to start lowering it. It starts going under my meshes, disappears, but now my trees start dropping underneath. So I'm going to leave this at 0 as well, but I'm going to disable it so I don't see it. And now I have the same thing here, tree and detail objects. Well, these are my tree objects, and I can turn them off, but if I do that, they disappear here. However, these are terrain drawn objects. They're attached to my terrain, okay? GS Pro can't use those. GS Pro needs trees that are in the scene itself. So there's a process I'll show you guys in a later video where we convert these to game objects. And I did that here, and they end up in this container here called trees generated. Now this is disabled. I kept this disabled for now just to illustrate my point. I'm going to turn these on. And now what happens is you see, hey, there's all my trees generated. And if I turn them off, what happens? Well, they're still there. Well, they're not. What you're seeing when I turn these off are the trees on my inner terrain. So with trees generated turned on, I'm actually double rendering. I'm drawing these trees twice, which really impacts performance. Okay. If I turn on my scene, actually let me do it here for you guys, just show you as an example how to see this. I'm in my scene, and you can see I'm up to 1.5 million tries right now. Now, if I go to my trees generated and I turn those off, I don't see any difference here. Now I'm seeing my Unity planted terrains, but my objects dropped to 1 million. So I got rid of 500K tries by just turning it off, and my frames per second go up and down because I'm double rendering my trees. So how do I fix this? Well, how I fix this is going to my terrain inner and turning off my terrain inner draw. That way my Unity terrain trees aren't being drawn, only my trees generated are being drawn, and I'm only rendering once. So now you can see I'm down to 1 million tries. Now remember, if I leave my game mode and I come back here, what happens? Well, things get reset, okay? So I'm in my terrain inner, I'm still drawing here. So I'm gonna turn that off. So now I'm looking at my trees generated. If I turn my trees generated off, everything should disappear because my terrain drawn trees in Unity are off and my trees generated are off. So now they disappear. I could go back in, turn on my trees or my terrain, and now they appear. But I want to leave those off, go back in the trees generated, turn those on. So that's a lot of the theory behind how we're going to end up painting trees and grasses and how we use terrains inside of Unity.